we can learn from the many persuasions that the purpose of the spiritual path has many different descriptions. The attainment of enlightenment, the attainment of nirvana, the attainment of liberation, the attainment of truth, the attainment of realization of God, the attainment of the state of the absence of illusion. But before asking the loaded question of you, what is the purpose of your spiritual path? We revert to a little Zen. Several old Zen stories. The first is about that young man who was a seeker after truth and roamed the world, going to the various centers that offered this truth, practicing free love and the drug way or the whirling way. But then, not happy with any of these, he happened to read that there was a certain monastery in the land of the rising sun that had as its tenets obedience, and discipline. And he thought to himself, this is for me. So he made his way to the monastery, and when he was in front of the abbot seeking admission to the monastery, the abbot again reminded him of the rules of that monastery, and that was obedience and discipline. And the young man thought to himself, I'm ready for it, I'm going to give it my all. So he did what it was that was laid down to do. He got up at 5 o'clock in the morning and went to the meditation hall and sat down in Zazen position. He chanted, he stirred the rice, he weeded the garden, he swept the kitchen floors. But after a time he noticed that the other members of that community didn't follow the disciplines and obedience at all. They slept in, they didn't turn up at the kitchen when it was their turn to stir the rice, and he got more and more angry. So he decided he was going to show all of these people. So he doubled up his efforts in Zazen, and he was in the kitchen on time stirring the rice. One day the abbot came by and said to him, I notice that you are not at all happy. What is it that is troubling you? And the young man said, well, I came here and I learned that you had to have obedience and discipline, and I'm practicing this, but I notice nobody else does, so I'm being an example of this. So the abbot looked at him and said, well, it appears to me that all that you're demonstrating is living and working in a state of anger and frustration, and that's no example at all. And so the young man, suitably chastened, said to the abbot, well, how should it be then? And the abbot said, of course, when the Buddha takes the Buddha broom and sweeps the Buddha floor and stirs the Buddha rice, then and only then will you be an example. And of course the young man was shattered. And then there's that story about the young monk who had been in the monastery for some years, and every day when the bell rang at 5 a.m., he was sitting in the meditation hall practicing his Zazen. And every day the abbot of the monastery would come by and see him there, and he would ask the young man the same question. Why are you sitting here practicing Zazen? And the young man would give the same answer every time. I'm practicing to attain enlightenment. But the young man each day got more and more angry and frustrated at the old abbot, disturbing his Zazen by asking the same question and receiving the same answer. But after a while, the young monk found that when he came down to the meditation hall to sit in his Zazen position, there was the old abbot sitting there cross-legged and had with a piece of cloth, and he was rubbing a brick. And after a while, the young monk couldn't help himself. He went over to the abbot and asked him, why are you doing this? Why are you sitting here rubbing this brick every day? And the old abbot said, well, I'm making a mirror. And the young monk said, that's impossible. How can you make a mirror out of a brick? And the abbot said, well, how can you attain enlightenment by sitting in Zazen every day? And the young man was shattered. And finally, there's this story about that seeker after enlightenment who went to the monastery that taught non-hurting and compassion as their main tenets, as many of these Buddhist teachings concentrate on compassion. He was in the monastery for decades, and finally it was time for him to leave. He indeed thought that his decades of concentration on compassion had brought this to him. So he left the monastery, and the monastery gate slammed behind him. But as he was walking down the road, there on the side of the road was a leper, sightless eyes, pus oozing out of them, fingers and toes missing, leprous sores suppurating all over his body. The monk came to this sight, and suddenly a great wave of compassion, and you might call it love, flowed through him. This was it. This was what he'd been seeking all of those years. So, bending down, he lifted the head of this being onto his lap, the compassion pouring from him, when the being with his sightless eyes looked up at the monk and said, "Who is it who comes between my God and me, even without my body? I have my love for him." The monk was shattered. The purpose of the spiritual path, what is it for you? Do you still have a goal, something to be attained, somewhere to reach? obedience and discipline. Practice, compassion. What do they mean for you now? What's the purpose of your spiritual journey? What's your raison d'etre, your reason for being? What is life to you?
For me, it's like uniting all experience into one thing. It's, and therefore there's no direction home, no path or no anything, because everything is one.
Thank you.